Then you can kind of read in about 10 minutes. I'm going to read parts of it today. And then if you say, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, a number of years ago, I wrote this book called Technology and Social Trends. This is the English version. By the way, if you have Spanish friends or you read Spanish, there's the Spanish version. So you can see that this is something we have been addressing for some time. And just before I get into it, let me just say that the remarkable change in the last few decades is not something that has escaped my notice. I remember back in the 1990s on Point of View when we would talk about some of these privacy issues. There were some things happening, for example, under the Clinton administration, even a little bit later under the Bush administration after 9/11, where there was a lot more intrusion into our private lives. And the privacy issues, whenever we would do a program on privacy, the phones would really ring and people would express some kind of concern. More recently on the program here, when we've done some things about privacy, and we certainly have talked about that in terms of surveillance, and John Whitehead and others have been on the program, the phones don't ring as much. And I think the theory, at least that I work from, is that back when everybody felt that their private life really was private, this was kind of an assault. But now that so many people have access to social media, and you can see, especially the younger generation saying, well, I don't really care if somebody knows something about my life because look at all the things I put on Facebook. Look at the embarrassing videos I post on YouTube. Look at some of the comments and snarky things I've said on Twitter. As a result, privacy has become less of an issue. But if you've ever listened to this program when we've talked about some of the privacy concerns, I'll mention the book by Michael Gillen, in which he has a whole section, a number of chapters on the issue of privacy, in which he points out that you may say, well, I don't really care if they have facial recognition or that people can follow me. But if you lived in China, you would care because you recognize that it really is classic Big Brother. And a little bit later this hour, I'm going to talk about how when you put together big data and big government, you end up with Big Brother. So I do want to certainly address that issue. But one of the reasons, of course, we're talking about this is because the Justice Department was able to obtain a FISA warrant. And you might say, okay, I've never really understood the background there. So for just a minute, let me talk about that because that's in our little booklet. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was implemented, was an attempt to really try to address some of the abuses that had happened back really in the Nixon administration. So this is in the 1970s. And so then that was updated during the first century of the 21st century because, of course, we had 9/11. And so the law is supposed to be used primarily for counterterrorism efforts and counter-espionage, but only once a FISA warrant has been obtained. And so the government really is supposed to show probable cause that a person in this country is acting as an agent of a foreign power. Now, a lot of civil libertarians, and by that I mean some civil libertarians tend to be on the left. Alan Dershowitz has been on this program, and he would be a good example. Some civil libertarians tend to be on the right. That might be a variety of people that write for, say, National Review or even, of course, I mentioned John Whitehead just a minute ago, have been concerned that the FISA program could be used to really spy on and begin to invade the privacy of American citizens. And so even back when the FISA warrants were first passed, and that was back in 1978, those questions certainly existed. And then since, of course, the attack on 9/11 in 2001, because we've had further attacks of terrorism, this has caused individuals sometimes to wonder whether or not this has been overdone. So for just a minute, I might just mention that sometimes the government surveillance can help us crack a crime. And so we recognize that. You might remember the bomb that blew up after the Boston Marathon and the way in which they were able to begin to identify those individuals was not through government surveillance, but in part because of the store security cameras across the street from a Lord and Taylor department store. We've had cameras, for example, in London that have helped identify terrorists. We've had surveillance video that helped us understand a little bit more about a shooting in Tucson. And so in some respects, we don't want to minimize the value of all these surveillance cameras. But the harsh reality is that wherever you go, there are cameras on you. Go into a store, there's cameras on you. Go out on the street, there are cameras on you. And a while back, Representative Peter King actually said that if you walk down the street, anyone can look at you, anyone can see where you're going. So really, you should have no expectation of privacy when you're out in public. But of course, I think we've all had a situation in which we thought we were, not in public view. There were no cameras watching us, and we had to, for example, adjust our clothing or do something that might have been a little more intimate. And then we look up and see there's a camera watching us. And so there's a sense in which, even though we don't necessarily have in this new 21st century world a reasonable expectation of privacy, I really want to come back and look at that in some more detail, because what we have now is what some people have called a super Snoop's dream. And so I'm going to quote from my book in that regard. And we sometimes say it's almost like you're that Truman in the Truman Show, where there are all sorts of cameras watching you 24/7. And of course, that was fiction. But the snooping that is taking place is really fact. And we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many of the Democratic presidential candidates have been critical of charter schools, and you may wonder why. After all, they are public schools and have a relatively good track record. David Osborne, writing in the Wall Street Journal, documents some of these changes made against charter schools. Senator Elizabeth Warren argues that these schools strain the resources of school districts. Senator Bernie Sanders also says the growth of the charter schools has drained funding from the public school system. This is interesting, since the only difference between charter schools and other public schools is the fact that they can operate independently of district bureaucracies. Of course, that's the real reason. Osborne reminds us that no interest group has more clout in Democratic primaries than teacher unions. In the last presidential election, the American Federation of Teachers and National Education Association combined spent $64 million. Charter schools are free to unionize, but rarely do. Only about 11% of them chose to do so. As the charter school movement grows, union influence shrinks. Charter schools are quite successful and provide an alternative to millions of students, two-thirds of which are non-white. Graduation rates, college-going rates, and college completion rates are also higher among students who enroll in charter schools. There is another benefit: competition. We don't have true school choice and won't get it anytime soon, but the presence of charter schools does provide some competition to the public schools. It encourages school leaders and teachers to improve their schools so that they are more attractive to parents wanting to give their children the best education they can receive. Charter schools don't deserve the criticism they are receiving these days from many of these candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again doing kind of a teaching today on surveillance and privacy. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read a little bit more of this article and booklet on privacy and surveillance is available. And a lot of what I'm going to be sharing now comes from my book, Technology and Social Trends. There's a couple of chapters there, and one of those gets into the issue of privacy and how it relates to Homeland Security. Because I want to keep a balance here. On the one hand, we are concerned, I think there is a legitimate concern about the invasion of privacy that some of us are facing. At the same time, some of that surveillance has helped us prevent terrorist activities. So we always want to try to balance that. And of course, when we talk about this, the Department of Homeland Security, of course, has a huge bureaucracy. It was created where the Congress compared and actually combined 22 different agencies, 170,000 federal employees, and the rest. So in some respects, we are appreciative of the fact that there are people trying to keep us safe. On the other hand, the concern is that if you don't have the right kind of safeguards, one columnist called it a super snoop's dream, and actually said in the column, you are a suspect. Because right now we have not only the surveillance that comes from the government, but we have the surveillance, if you will, of all sorts of businesses, which again can and oftentimes do turn over records, whether it's phone calls or all the rest. And here's just a couple of points that at least William Safire cited years ago, and it was true then, it's even more true now. He says, every purchase you make with a credit card, every magazine subscription you buy and medical prescription you fill, every website you visit and email you send or receive, every academic grade you receive, every bank deposit you make, every trip you book, and every event you attend, all these transactions and communications, he says, can go into the Defense Department or Homeland Security's grand centralized database. Now, do people spend all the time digging through that? Not necessarily, but you begin to realize that this is very, very different than what we've ever had before. He goes on to say this, to this computerized dossier on your private life from commercial sources, add every piece of information that the government has on you. Your passport application, driver's license, bridge toll records, judicial and divorce records, complaints from noisy neighbors to the FBI, your lifetime paper trail, the latest hidden camera surveillance, and you have a super snoop's dream, a total information awareness about every U.S. citizen. And that level of invasion in our privacy may not bother everyone, but it does bother a lot of us, especially when we recognize how that can be and has been misused in other countries. The classic example I used just a minute ago, of course, is China. Now, when you have the Homeland Security Act and you have the USA Patriot Act, many of those, of course, widen the scope of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and actually weakened a lot of these various privacy laws. And so as a result, when we hear about this abuse of FISA, we begin to wonder, is there maybe something that we should be doing to protect us? And that is a conversation that I would like to have. I would like to have our members of Congress have. And it's a conversation that rarely is brought up because the argument is always, well, look at the kind of threats we've been able to forestall. One of those, of course, have been the terrorist threats. But you also have a whole series of other things as well, because as Lincoln Kaplan writes in Legal Affairs, that the current law, which is the U.S. Patriot Act, quote, authorizes law enforcement agencies to inspect the most personal kinds of information, medical records, bank statements, college transcripts, even church memberships. But what is even more startling, he says, than the scope of these new powers is that the government can use them on people who aren't suspected of committing a crime, unquote. And I think that illustrates the issue there as well. Again, we want to pay attention to the fact that some people that are immigrating here using visas, we recognize that visas were actually used for the 9/11 hijackers. And so you have
quite a number of individuals, easily more than 100,000 from Iraq and the Middle East that are here illegally, hundreds of thousands of others from other countries. Some of those individuals do not intend us harm, but some of them do. And so this is kind of one of the great concerns that people have, I think, legitimately raised. So just before we take another break, let me just, if nothing else, remind us that when we talk about this kind of power of information, when in the past we didn't have access to that kind of information, I've oftentimes pointed out that when the Nazis wanted to round up the Jews, those records were kept basically in index cards in shoeboxes. If you wanted to round up a group of individuals today, it would just require maybe a pushing of a button. And so we hope that we will never have those kinds of powers in the hands of evil people, at least in this country. They are in the hands of people that have evil intent in other countries, and that's something to pay attention to. But let's just really quickly, before we finish this segment, talk about how even with the other kind of less sophisticated technology, we've sometimes had the use and abuse of government power. Because if you think about this, our second president of the United States, who would be President John Adams, used what was called the Alien and Sedition Act to imprison his political enemies and curb newspaper editors critical of him. Later on, you have Abraham Lincoln using that, which might be a little more of justifiable in terms of getting rid of habeas corpus during the Civil War. But again, it shows how presidents have used and many times misused government power. We have, of course, President Woodrow Wilson, who permitted his then Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, to stop political dissent during what were called the Palmer raids. And on more than one occasion, I've talked about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was able to intern hundreds of thousands, about 200,000 Japanese American citizens during World War II. So we've seen some of that as well. And, of course, if you think about this, the Civil War provided all sorts of justification for the vast expansion of power. I mentioned, of course, Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, which is a demand that you bring a prisoner before those individuals. But this was suspended, so it led to the imprisonment. The imprisonment during the Civil War of physicians, lawyers, journalists, soldiers, farmers, draft resistors. 16 members of the Maryland legislature were arrested in order to prevent them from voting for their state to secede from the Union. And by the time the Civil War was over, 13,535 arrests had been made. And so we can see that sometimes during a time of crisis, there is a lot less of a concern about people's privacy and even their constitutional rights. And then, of course, we've had all sorts of other concerns as well. The use, for example, and the expansion of what you might call the RICO laws, which is the Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. All sorts of seizure laws where, in many cases, the police have been able to confiscate cars and boats and homes without due process. And some of these have happened under Democratic administrations, also Republican administrations. And so it just illustrates, again, maybe a concern that even in this time in which there is a reasonable concern about how to protect us, we need to come back to some of our fundamental civil liberty rights under the Fourth Amendment. And so we'll take a break and come back and talk a little bit more about some of the examples of illegal surveillance that have taken place. Then I want to move on to this idea that what happens when you have big data actually working with big government. Big data with big government becomes Big Brother. And so I want to get into some of that as well, because these databases are so huge and are maintained not just by the government, but a lot in business. And the advantage to actually using this for marketing, for even surveillance, is very great. But again, what is the impact in terms of our own privacy, on our expectation of privacy? And then before we end, I'm going to give you some Christian perspectives on this, because after all, in a world where almost everything we say and do is out there, I think it's a reminder that perhaps it would be time, as it says in Philippians 2, to do all things without grumbling and disputing, to prove yourself to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. If indeed so much of what you do is now exposed, maybe living your life above reproach is a very good idea. It was always important in the first century. It may be absolutely essential in the 21st century. So we'll talk more about that in just a minute as we talk about this very important issue of surveillance and privacy. If you'd like to know a little bit more, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about surveillance and privacy. And if you'd like to get some more information, let me mention again that my booklet on privacy and surveillance is available to you, as well as I'm quoting from a few of the chapters in my book, Technology and Social Trends, which is both in English as well as this copy in Spanish. So if you would like to get more information, feel free to contact us at Point of View. Let me also mention that before I get into this idea of big data, we have had other people on this program over the years that have expressed some concern. Andrew McCarthy has been on the program, but more recently when he wrote a commentary, which we quoted and I used in one of my commentaries, said that during the Obama administration, the National Security Agency intentionally and routinely intercepted and reviewed communications of American citizens, he says, in violation of the Constitution and of court-ordered guidelines implemented pursuant to federal law. And he says this is backed up, of course, with some of the other things that have happened with the FISA court. And I point out that there are really kind of two problems. First is what you might call the incidental collection of data from Americans that occurs when an intelligence agency targets one suspect, because what you have is a situation in which you might have what's called upstream collection of information. Okay, what's that? Well, Andrew McCarthy explains that it's really not possible to capture just a single email related to a single target, so the National Security Agency must capture packets of email data, which includes lots of emails besides the targeted email. That means your communications are being seized and subjected to inspection without any warrant or probable cause. So you might say, well, I've never talked to a terrorist. I don't think a terrorist has ever contacted me. But those packets of information aren't necessarily being easily separated out. And so you might say, well, that doesn't really matter because, again, I'm not really interacting with anybody in the terrorist community. I'm not interacting with anybody that's involved in any kind of criminal activity. But as they're looking for anybody that's to or from the target, you may be interacting with somebody that was a target in one way or another. And so that is very difficult to understand. So that is to recognize that, first of all, you're going to get upstream communication. Also, second of all, of course, you're going to get those packets of information. So people that hear that say, well, wait a minute. I mean, back when the Bush administration was saying that they were going to listen in on phone calls or read emails, I remember even some of the individuals around the table trying to assure all of our listeners that they were looking for terrorists and criminals. They would not be monitoring your communication. Well, it turns out that wasn't true after all. So that's the first one from Andrew McCarthy. The other one, I've been mentioning John Whitehead. He's been on the program with us before, the Rutherford Institute. And he talked about the fact that all the way back in the 1960s, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas warned that we are rapidly entering the age of no privacy, where everyone is open to surveillance at all times, where there are no secrets from the government. And if that was somewhat true in the 1960s, it is very true in the 21st century, because the government has been able to expand dramatically and to actually, as he points out, sidestep what it feels are inconvenient laws, which are supposed to provide accountability. One example I think I've already used, but let's go back to it again. That is, the National Security Agency has been diverting internet traffic overseas, and because of that, then it helps them easily bypass the Fourth Amendment for an unreasonable and unconstitutional search and seizure, and allows them to have unrestrained data collection in that regard. And then, of course, there are stories of the government, interestingly enough, hacking into Google and Yahoo data centers, which is kind of funny because back when we talked about that even a little over a year ago, that was some hacking, but lots of times these social media sites willingly turn over that information to the government for one reason or another. So hacking was only necessary some of the time.
But John Whitehead estimates that on any given day, the average American is monitored, surveilled, tracked, and spied on more than 20 different ways. And so, again, it gives you just a little bit of an idea of what that might mean, and one of the reasons why we put together this booklet on privacy and surveillance. But let me get to this whole idea of big data. You may have heard the term big data, maybe not. There is really an excellent book that I've even brought into the studio before. It's a really huge book called The Human Face of Big Data. And my argument has always been that when you add big data with big government, you end up, in a sense, with Big Brother. And so let's first of all define big data. This is kind of the new way in which information is being collected unbelievably by all sorts of different entities. Digital facts, figures, products, books, music, video, much, much more. And as a result, Eric Schmidt, who at that time was the executive chairman for Google, estimates that humans now create in 2 days the same amount of data that it took from the dawn of civilization till about 2003. So we're just generating massive amounts of digital data now. And of course, in order to even handle it, there have been all sorts of server farms and other things developed just to be able to store it, because a lot of people would say, well, I don't want to keep a picture that I used 20 years ago, or I don't want to keep a Twitter feed that I no longer even have online because I decided I didn't even like Twitter, or I didn't like how people were bullying me or whatever. The reality is it exists somewhere, and not just somewhere, but many places. And so this is a situation in which we, first of all, are creating lots of data, and also that it makes it very possible to access that data instantaneously. And this, of course, in the midst of this kind of tsunami of data, can have a real impact in our lives. For example, as I mentioned before, this article that came in USA Today explains how big data is being used. Retailers, they say, can target you with online purchasing appeals because of the data that they've already collected from you when you were online. They can suggest books, videos, and various products that you would be interested in. And if this is news to you, you haven't been online very much, because exactly that has been happening for some time. Okay, if you have a smartphone, we can do all sorts of things. We can figure out where you went to get something to eat, where you got gas. Matter of fact, of course, it can even tell you where the closest gas station is, but it also can tell you where you are, because if your GPS is on there, it's being used to, first of all, figure out where you are to help you find someplace else. But anybody who has access to that can actually figure where you've driven all day, every day, and where you've actually spent your time. And so big data really gives you the ability to collect and analyze information never possible before. It's good for trend watchers, good for businesses, good for corporations, even good for government to try to understand the world that we live in. But at the same time, you have to think about the fact that when you put big data with big government, could that end up being Big Brother? And by Big Brother, I'm talking about, of course, that book, 1984, kind of this dystopian novel that talks about a world where everybody, in a sense, is available. And there's some other novels that have come out there as well. There was one in which it had a novel where everybody lived in a world full of glass so that people could monitor you through the glass. Well, that shows an archaic view, because we could actually have you in rooms that have no glass at all and know exactly what you're doing, knowing what kind of websites you're going on. And as you go out of your home, figure out where you're going, what you're doing, who you're meeting, and what you're eating, where you're buying your gas, where you're buying your food, and all of the rest. And so you have to think about the fact that, as he says, every time you have a customs officer check a passport, every time someone puts a post to Facebook, every time someone does a Google search, this ocean of data continues to swell. And this data can sometimes be very intrusive, because as we see, some individuals have found that in other countries, they've been able to use this digital world to actually track down criminals and terrorists, but also track down individuals that maybe are perceived as a threat to the government. And that, of course, brings us to George Orwell's book, 1984. So as I've pointed out before, the government has been a little bit apathetic about investigating this. I come back to the Peter King statement that if you walk down the street and anyone can look at you, well, you don't have privacy there. So you don't have an expectation of privacy when you're in public. But I think I'd also be able to argue that you don't really now have an expectation of privacy when you're private either, because of this new world that we find ourselves in. So we come back from the break. There was a TV show called Person of Interest that kind of reminds us of how much information the government has. And then I thought it might just give a Christian perspective on how do we respond to the invasion of privacy in this age of surveillance. We'll be back right after this.
People looking to shop this year for the gender confused have options. Online fashion collections and even retail shops feature what's being called gender-free clothing. Gender-free clothing has been out there for years. I received an ad from a clothing company called Primary that gives kids a chance to choose from a rainbow of colors. The photo shows a kid in a blue dress. It's labeled the boy's long-sleeve dress in cobalt. More recently, some companies have taken trans retail. Fluid Project is a store located in Manhattan's Soho neighborhood. Fortune magazine explains the space is a combination store, cafe, and event space geared toward the LGBTQ community. Inside is an open sales floor with no gender-specific departments. Instead, there are non-gendered mannequins with straight hips in clothing emblazoned with messages like the phrase, "they power." In addition to the New York location, Fluid partnered with HBO's series Euphoria last summer to open one-day-only pop-up shops in San Francisco, Seattle, and Miami. Euphoria explores the inner worlds of troubled high school students with strong themes surrounding gender identity. In these stores, shoppers were invited to sit in on panel discussions with cast members. Fluid Project founder Rob Smith draws on his 30 years of executive retail experience with brands including Nike, Levi, Macy's, and Victoria's Secret. He says, "We want to erase any preconceived notions of how people should dress." Cosmetics giant Sephora added Trans is Beautiful to its diversity push and offers beauty classes for transgender people. H&M offers a unisex collection that includes mostly denim pieces, jeans, overalls, jackets, and also some hoodies and t-shirts. And Zara has a line dubbed Ungendered. Some of these companies, like H&M, are simply checking the inclusivity box. Others, like Fluid, seek to destigmatize the trans identity. I wish this was a passing fad, but these retail executives are mainstreaming a destructive delusion. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Have a few more minutes talking about surveillance and privacy. Let me just mention the booklet that is available. And, of course, you can go to pointofview.net and ask for a copy or even give us a call on our order line, 800-347-5151. And I thought for just a minute before we get into some of the Christian analysis of this issue of privacy and surveillance, I might also point to a television program that helped illustrate some of these issues. And that is the TV program that was out a number of years ago called Person of Interest. Now, it was put together by Jonathan Nolan, and even though, as everybody will acknowledge, that the storyline is fiction, it was based upon real-life source material that Jonathan Nolan had found, for example, in the book The Watchers, The Rise of America's Surveillance State, and also he had found some material that was from what ultimately became the kind of the defunct Office of Total Information Awareness. And he really kind of raised the question in that television program about what would be like if all this data were controlled by this very intelligent computer with artificial intelligence. And it isn't the first time he's raised questions about surveillance, because even in addition to the TV program Person of Interest, if you've ever watched the movie The Dark Knight, he actually co-wrote the script for the movie and actually inserted a scene, which you might remember, where Batman turns all of the Gotham City cell phones into tracking devices so that he can find the location of the Joker. And again, illustrating how you could use this to find a criminal, but also how you, in the process, violate everybody's privacy and take over their phones. And so it's a big issue that actually is a subplot in the movie The Dark Knight. Well, in an interview that Jonathan Nolan did, the interviewer said Nolan got a taste of encroaching surveillance while growing up in North London neighborhood. He said Scotland Yard began putting up cameras everywhere, he recalls, long before local phone hacking scandals erupted. And he said there were cameras out on these different street corners. English police employed cameras. Then when he moved to the States at the age of 12, he said there weren't any cameras here, but now you're seeing the cities catching up. And back then, he was talking about that there were about 5,000 cameras in Manhattan. That's in 2005. That number now is just completely uncountable. And then when you add all the cell phone cameras in the population, the argument he made is you really have lost your privacy. So he illustrated some of that in a TV program and, of course, raised some of those questions in a movie. But I thought, just before we wind down, how do we think about this? A couple of issues. First of all, I think we recognize that government does have the right and the responsibility to keep us safe. Romans 13, 1-7 teaches that government is, and civil government is, divinely ordained by God. And so this means that when the government bears the sword, it is to protect us from foreign invaders, from terrorists, from criminals and others. On the other hand, I think we should also work to prevent unwanted and unwarranted intrusions into our privacy and even violations of our constitutional liberties. And what we have found is these so-called public records weren't all that public. Now they're all too public, and even private records are becoming public at a rate that is, I think, rather concerning. So here's a couple of points. Number one, I just mentioned earlier, but let's come back to it again. We should live our lives above reproach. Philippians 2, 14 and 15 says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world." Or you can look at 2 Timothy 3, verse 2, which talks about the fact that an elder should be above reproach. Now, that is certainly true about people in church leadership, but I think it applies to all of us that we should live our lives above reproach. So that's number one. Number two, I think we do need to get involved. You know, we talk about on Point of View so often the need for us to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. If you feel that your privacy has been violated, when you believe there's been an unwarranted government intrusion into your life, I think you should take the time to complain. Let that person, let the organization, the government agency know your concerns. After all, I've said before that we should apply the same rules of privacy and confidentiality in the computer world that we do in the real world. You would think it would be inappropriate for somebody to rifle through your desk, but sometimes people don't think there's anything wrong with actually accessing all of your computer information and things of that nature. So that's another point that I thought we would put on the table. Third, I think we should call members of Congress and express some of our concern about this idea of privacy and surveillance. I've pointed out, for example, the Patriot Act and the Homeland Security Act, and the attempt to try to protect us from terrorism sometimes has put us in a situation where we've lost some of our privacy, and I think it's worth actually taking some time to address some of those issues. So in our little booklet here, I talk about some of those, if you will, theological explanations, and all of that is well. But let me also, in conclusion, give you some practical ideas, because not only should we, in a sense, live our lives above reproach, and not only should we recognize that government does have the authority and the responsibility to protect us, but it also has the right to protect us from an unwarranted intrusion. And so as we're seeing more and more of our privacy being violated, let me mention a couple of action items. Number one, don't give out so much personal information. I mean, you should assume that when you're giving out information, any kind of information, that it's not just going to be given to that individual. It's going to end up in a database somewhere. So whether it's phone solicitors, application forms, warranty cards, all of them ask for information. You might want to be a little bit more careful about how much information you disclose. And I have a good friend that thought that they were talking to Apple and found out they were not. And this just ruined their credit. So I think a little bit of wisdom is a good idea. Number two, exercise discretion, especially when you use email. Too many people assume that when you're communicating on email, it's just a one-to-one relationship with someone on the internet. But we all know, because we've all done it, that that message may be forwarded on to other individuals. And so I love what one website provider says. A good rule of thumb, don't send any email that you wouldn't want your mother to read. I thought it was a great line there. And then finally, as I've said before, I think it's really time to get involved. If you've heard us talk about some of these issues, then I think it is time to maybe express your concern to your member of Congress, maybe even tract congressional legislation, write letters. There are some very significant threats to our privacy. And again, I would imagine that until you heard this presentation over this last hour, you might have been unaware of some of the growing threats to your privacy. But I come back to some of the things that John Whitehead pointed out, because that was really kind of shocking to think about the fact that when you actually look at some of the material that he has talked about on this program, he estimates that on any given day, the average American is monitored, surveilled, tracked, and spied on in more than 20 different ways. So maybe it is time for us to stand up and express our opinion. One of the reasons why we have this booklet on privacy and surveillance, and of course we have some of the other material, including my book on technology and social trends, and we certainly want to make that available to you. So simply go to the website, pointofview.net, and if you want to express your opinion, there's a place for you to do so. And if you found this conversation over this last hour helpful, there is a button that says donate. And if you would like to donate, we would encourage you to do so, because you may this last hour heard some things you've never heard before. And so I hope that you'll recognize that in order for us to continue bringing these kinds of programs, even this particular teaching hour, we're dependent upon your financial gifts to do that. So visit the website, pointofview.net, get some of the material, and if you can make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Political fundraising literally reaches into the billions of dollars, many times promoting ideas of governance that aren't worth 2 cents. In that light, I want to ask you, how much are the ideas we distribute through Point of View Radio worth to you? How much are those ideas worth to the country? $100,000. Is that a lot of money in your world? If you're like me, that's a pretty big number. But it's an amount a generous friend of Point of View Radio has committed to give if we can get you to help match it. We need your help as we plan for the important year of 2020. Your gift here at year end will be huge in determining what we can do next year. And again, because of this matching gift, your donation is worth twice as much. But this offer is only for a limited time. Don't wait. Get all the details now at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Your doubled gift will spread good ideas to build strong values and a strong nation. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. This is our Friday before Christmas, and so this is going to be another one of those weekend edition programs, and boy, what a week we've had. So there's a lot to talk about, and I might just mention that if you find yourself saying you'd like to read a little bit more, we have a fairly long list of various articles that you might want to read, including a video, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Penna Dexter, co-host, is here, and of course Lathan Watts, who is the Director of Community Relations, and apparently a musician as well, which you'll see in the video a little bit later. So, Penna, once again, we have lots to talk about, but it's been a long time since you and I have been in this studio talking about an impeachment.
It has. Now, normally we would probably be talking about the striking down of the individual mandate in Obamacare, but I don't even know if that's going to be on the table today.
I'll get there,
but
not yet.
But yes, it has been quite a week, and it's so funny because just a couple days ago, I was sort of starting to think about what we'd say about it, and we're talking about Chuck Schumer requesting certain witnesses to be in the Senate trial, and now today we're talking about, well, will there or will there not be a trial in the Senate? And you know, the way I look at that is, what was all this for? It was just a show. I mean, we've said that anyway, but in a sense, it was just something. If they don't have a trial in the Senate, and if they withhold the actual, and you can explain this, or we all can try to explain how this would actually work, where the House would actually not release this to the Senate, and their reasons for doing so. But if that happens, I don't know. I just am scratching my head at the other party out there that's making all this happen.
And I might just mention, we had a presidential debate last night, and they were trying to figure out what they did, and not everybody's on the same page on this. We do have the audio of what Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell said, but I'll postpone that a little bit later because we don't know if we have a Senate trial. There are at least a few people that have expertise in constitutional government that say, if these articles of impeachment are never passed over to the Senate, then it really wasn't an impeachment. And right now everybody's saying, well, he was the third president impeached. Maybe not. So that's a very interesting argument there as well. And I also posted something by Marco Rubio saying, well, you guys have been interested in impeaching. Well, we've been doing all sorts of things over in the Senate, so we'll talk about that as well. And we will talk about USMCA because that's a treaty. We'll talk about the individual mandate being struck down. Ben Shapiro reminding us that the Ninth Circuit Court came with a crazy ruling and all sorts of other issues. And during the Christmas season, we'll be talking about all the attempts to try to be the modern-day Grinches. But let me first come to Lathan. This is supposed to be historic, but I think it was, as some people said, kind of surreal because people wondered how serious it really was.
Yeah, you know, it was criticized from the very beginning as to are they really serious about this? And, you know, you don't have to go too far back in memory to to remember Nancy Pelosi saying that she would not file articles of impeachment unless there was bipartisan support for it.
Yeah,
and
there
a
wasn't.
few weeks later, here we are. There clearly was not bipartisan support for it, and they did it anyway. She has allowed herself really to be painted into a corner by the most radical bloc of her caucus. She is, in my opinion, the leader of the House in name only. She has the title, and she has the authority, run the schedule and all of that. But that party is being driven by folks like AOC, Ilhan Omar, the Squad, some of the most radical elements of that party, who were not going to accept anything but an impeachment hearing and articles of impeachment. And that's, I think, why we saw the show that we did. And that's what it was a show. By the time they finally got around to actually, here are the 2 articles of impeachment, there's not even a crime alleged in the articles of impeachment. The Constitution is pretty clear. It's not crystal clear, and they intentionally left it open to interpretation. But treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, not obstruction of justice, obstruction of Congress, there's no crime alleged in either of these articles.
That's very true.
So what exactly, if we do have a trial, are we trying in the Senate?
Yeah.
It was either some kind of a show to just affect the election, and Nancy Pelosi's attempt to, I'd say, retain her speakership, or they are really bullying the Senate and trying to control not only what the House did, but now they want to control what the Senate does, because they think that if they withhold this, they're somehow withholding the president's chance to perhaps exonerate himself by having a trial. I don't know. They think that they're hurting the right and the Republicans by withholding this. I'm not sure if they are. I think they're showing themselves to be buffoons in a sense.
McConnell's response was as good as I wish I had written it, which is, I don't know how much leverage you have by threatening not to give us something we didn't want in the first place.
Was a good line, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And again, there are some individuals. Let's talk about Nancy Pelosi. Let's mention James Clyburn. He's the Democrat from South Carolina. And he said he's willing to hold on to these as long as it takes because, and I thought this was a little bit brash, we don't want a kangaroo trial in the Senate, which of course is what individuals have been saying was taking place in the House of Representatives. So nevertheless, that's the first article we posted here on whether the Senate trial is in doubt. If we do have a Senate trial, I think one of the best things I've ever read is by Adam White. It's a very lengthy piece, but it reminds us and takes us back to some of the Federalist Papers, most of which, interestingly enough, were written by Alexander Hamilton about what that should be, Federalist Paper number 65. And those of us that went to graduate school in government had to read those Federalist Papers and exegete them almost the way you would do the Bible. And I think Adam White did a very good job of saying they're not sitting there as impartial jurors. They're sitting there as senators. And the reason they had the articles of impeachment drawn up by the House is they were going to be riven by passions and factions. But then the idea was to send it to the Senate, where maybe cooler heads would prevail. And until we had the 16th Amendment, these were individuals that were actually put in that position by their state legislatures. And even to this day, I'd say that these are individuals that, because they serve for 6 years, they represent the entire state, they may have a little more, at least some, might have a little more objective view. And that's why the framers did it the way they did.
I think this is so timely because of this whole question of whether it's going to be sent over to the Senate or not. Because it really does seem like they're trying to get some kind of, assurances that the Senate will conduct this fairly like a courtroom and like judges. And this piece explains why senators, yes, they were chosen to have the trial, but they aren't supposed to change or morph into judges. They're still senators. They're still people that are political in nature. And they have so much knowledge of the situation that they're the best people, according to the founders, to conduct this, but it doesn't mean that they have to be completely impartial.
That's for sure. And I think it might be worth pointing out that some people say, well, you've got the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice, presiding over that, but in all the other impeachment areas of judges and things like that, they don't. And the only reason for that, I think, and this article makes a very good case for that as well, is because otherwise the person presiding over it would be the vice president. It'd be a conflict of interest. But otherwise, this is something really outside of the purview of the other chamber of Congress and even the Supreme Court. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many of the Democratic presidential candidates have been critical of charter schools, and you may wonder why. After all, they are public schools and have a relatively good track record. David Osborne, writing in the Wall Street Journal, documents some of these changes made against charter schools. Senator Elizabeth Warren argues that these schools strain the resources of school districts. Senator Bernie Sanders also says the growth of the charter schools has drained funding from the public school system. This is interesting since the only difference between charter schools and other public schools is the fact that they can operate independently of district bureaucracies. Of course, that's the real reason. Osborne reminds us that no interest group has more clout in Democratic primaries than teacher unions. In the last presidential election, the American Federation of Teachers and National Education Association combined spent $64 million. Charter schools are free to unionize, but rarely do. Only about 11% of them chose to do so. As the charter school movement grows, union influence shrinks. Charter schools are quite successful and provide an alternative to millions of students, two-thirds of which are non-white. Graduation rates, college-going rates, and college completion rates are also higher among students who enroll in charter schools. There is another benefit, competition. We don't have true school choice and won't get it anytime soon, but the presence of charter schools does provide some competition to the public schools. It encourages school leaders and teachers to improve their schools so that they are more attractive to parents wanting to give their children the best education they can receive. Charter schools don't deserve the criticism they are receiving these days from many of these candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, privileged to have in studio with us today, Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts. And let's, if we can, just real quickly hear kind of the back and forth between the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. This all, of course, is hypothetical because guess what? The articles of impeachment were not sent over to the Senate, and everybody took off for home. So if it happens at all, that's going to be in the future. And
they say January 7th would be the earliest.
That'd be the earliest. And there was supposed to be a meeting between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer to kind of iron some of this out. And that didn't happen from what I understand. So first of all, let's hear from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, because he criticized the White House and felt that unless we call witnesses, this would be the equivalent of a cover-up.
Trials have witnesses. That's what trials are all about. And documents. It's not just the prosecutors, in this case, the House attorneys make their side, the president's lawyers make their side. We know that already. We've heard that. We need to know the facts from those who are in a position to know and from documents that accurately reflect them. So, to engage a trial without the facts coming out is to engage in a cover-up. To conduct a trial without the facts is saying we're afraid. We have something to hide. To conduct a trial without relevant witnesses who haven't been heard from, to just rehash the evidence presented in the House, just doesn't make any sense. I haven't seen a single good argument about why these witnesses shouldn't testify or these documents be produced, unless the president has something to hide and his supporters want that information hidden. I expect to have the support from Democrats and Republicans because the argument is so strong. And many Republicans have voiced to me and many of my colleagues privately that they think what the president did is wrong, but they're just not sure enough facts have been presented to make an impeachable case, high crimes and misdemeanors.
So again, comments by Chuck Schumer. And let me just also, to be fair, also have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, because he rejected some of these ideas that we need witnesses, seemed to be suggesting that if you did a bad work project over in the House, we're not supposed to fix that. But nevertheless, he has a different point of view.
The Democratic leader's letter to me, by the way, by way of the press, literally misquoted the Constitution. Senator Schumer wrote that we should exercise, quote, the Senate's sole power of impeachment under the Constitution with integrity and dignity. He attributed to the Senate, quote, the sole power of impeachment. Well, there's his problem, Mr. President. That's the role the Constitution gives actually to the House, not to the Senate. To give it to the House. Article 1, Section 2 says the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. Doesn't sound ambiguous to me. If my colleague wants to read about our responsibilities here in the Senate, he needs to turn to the next page. Article 1, Section 3 says the Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. We don't create impeachments over here, Mr. President. We judge them. The House chose this road. It's their duty to investigate. It's their duty to meet the very high bar for undoing a national election.
I think Mitch McConnell has it right. First of all, points out an error in terms of actually understanding the Constitution. And I don't know, but Mitch McConnell 2.0 has really been quite inviting and encouraging just to see some of the things he said over the last couple of days.
It has. It's pretty funny in one sense to be able to call out the minority leader for his knowledge of the Constitution, his misstating of the Constitution. And he does it. His demeanor when he speaks, McConnell is just kind of cute. But yes, it's been very good, and he's actually signaled things to the other side. I think in ways that it's made Nancy Pelosi very nervous. It's made the Democrats very nervous to hear that what they think of this. It's almost like dismissing it out of hand in one sense, and yet taking it very seriously in another, because it really does, I think, show what Constitution, people who adhere to the Constitution, it shows what they think of this whole process and that they don't respect it, but yet they respect the Constitution and their role, and they will carry it out.
Yes. Lathan, any comments? This Mitch McConnell 2.0 is amazing to me. I've not heard him say some things like he has in his last 2 weeks.
Yes, but I was just encouraged to know that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer finally found a copy of the Constitution.
These are individuals that say these were racist and other people we don't pay attention to, and then all of a sudden they're quoting the founders.
They suddenly found the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and the Founding Fathers when they've spent their entire career trashing all three and telling you that the Constitution just means whatever we say it means because it's a living document. And if they say anything about the founders, it's how many of them owned slaves, and therefore you should ignore everything that they've ever said or written. But now there's a president they don't like, and they discover the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and the genius of the Founding Fathers. Well, welcome to the party.
Yeah.
I mean, the rest of us have known this for a really long time. I mean, I was, tempted to send a link to Pelosi's office. You can get a free copy of the Constitution at firstliberty.org. Like, you ever want to read it, we'll provide you one for free.
Yes.
So I was happy to know that they have discovered the Constitution, but apparently they don't read it very well.
A couple of things about what Schumer is demanding. Number one, when he's asking for all the documentation and the different people to testify, some of this is what was already refused by the administration under executive privilege. And all presidents have defended their executive privilege. In fact, as a matter of fact, if they don't defend it, then they are actually not doing their job. So in a sense, to get, for instance, members of his administration, his chief of staff do have to testify, or his former national security advisor, Bolton. Of course, I think Trump's worried about Bolton because Bolton's kind of mad from being fired. But still, it's his prerogative to invoke executive privilege. And yet this is another part of this that the Democrats are trying to control. They want to know who is going to be out there testifying. And yet there are people that the Trump administration would like to send in to testify, like Hunter Biden, for instance.
Sure.
And they,
whistleblower.
That's not,
yeah.
and the whistleblower, and that's not appropriate, according to them.
Yeah, so Rand Paul talked about the fact that, if anything, you have to have the right to face your accusers. And then some have tried to, with a straight face, say, well, the Sixth Amendment really doesn't apply to the president in impeachment, which doesn't pass the straight face test. But these people have said some things with straight faces that are absolutely inaccurate and lies. But nevertheless, it's just been one of those interesting discussions.
Yeah, and this is where the article that you posted from National Review is really helpful, because it talks about the dangers in taking the trial analogy too far.
Yes.
Because this is not a trial.
It's not a trial.
Court.
It's not intended. Yeah.
It's not intended to be. All the same rules that apply in a typical courtroom scenario are not applied in an impeachment, in a trial of the president in the Senate. He is not under criminal prosecution like he would be in a court. So that's where the analogy really kind of makes things, kind of muddles things a little bit. But if you want to stick with that analogy, what they are, Article 2 that they invented, obstruction of Congress,
yes,
they based that on his claiming executive privilege and not providing things that they asked for. This would be the equivalent of forcing someone to testify against themselves.
I think that's Fifth Amendment, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yes. So there you
when
go.
you are in court in a criminal matter, you don't have to say a word. You don't have to present witnesses. You don't have all the defense has to do is sit there and poke holes in the prosecution's case.
Yes.
And so, if you want to have that analogy, and I think the article points out the reasons why it's dangerous to carry it too far, but McConnell is right in that, in his initial statement, that we can. If we're going to do this, if they send the articles over here, the only thing that's necessary, we can have a statement by the House, by the House managers, and we can have a statement from the president, whoever he designates, and we can vote.
That'd be that.
You don't need anything else.
No, you certainly don't.
Because there's no crime alleged. The underlying basis for all of this, all you need is the transcript of the phone call, which was provided weeks ago. And you already know everything you need to know.
Yeah.
There's no reason to do anything else. If you want to have, Penna's right. If you want to start calling witnesses, okay, well, let's call Joe Biden, and then let's call Hunter Biden.
And again, you're
then
sort of talking about this idea of presumption of innocence too. Really, when you think about that. And the other day, I was watching one of these very liberal talk shows, which is kind of like hitting your head with a hammer. But nevertheless, I was saying, well, because the president didn't defend himself, that means he's got something to hide. And I'm thinking, no. Sometimes the best defense is to actually have the defense attorney stand up and say, Your Honor, the prosecution's case is unconvincing. I ask for a summary judgment. End of discussion. Right there. But that's the way we do it in other courts. We'll be right back.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Lots more to cover, and we will certainly do so. Let me just mention a little bit later, of course, Christianity Today editorial coming out thinking that the president should be removed from office, so we will get to that. Of course, the action on USMCA, which I think is going to be helpful, but also there's some real concerns that we can raise about that. And all sorts of action happening in the Senate while the House is focusing on impeachment. So those are just a few issues we'll get to in the future. But for just a minute, there's nothing else to maybe lighten it up a little bit. I've got a picture right now here of Lathan Watts with a Santa Claus hat on. And if you go to the website, pointofview.net, or you go to First Liberty, but we've made it real easy, this is a special edition. And he's been doing these great videos called Legalese. And this one is on some of the ridiculous attacks on various groups during the Christmas season. There are Grinches that are all over the place. Some of them are secular groups. Some of them are government agencies. And he takes us through some of that, but also has a little bit of fun trying to sing some songs and keeps getting interrupted because the songs, even the Christmas songs, are not politically correct. But you were having a little bit of fun here, I can tell.
Absolutely. Yeah, we started this... This idea started from a conversation I had with our marketing director, Todd Winking, and I was just sort of offhand said, my job really as director of communications is to translate legalese into English. It's to take the stuff that we do that can sometimes be technical and complex and put it in terms that the general public understands why it's important, and then understands why they should support First Liberty. And kind of, you can almost see the light bulb go off above his head, and he's like, "That's what we have to call it legalese." But we'll spell ease, E-A-S-E, like you're going to make things legal, easy to understand.
Yes, very good.
Okay, so that's where the idea came from, and so we've done 4 of them now. The first one was a little more straightforward, academic. It was about Jefferson's Wall of Separation,
right?
And we sort of explained the context of that and where it came from, and then we moved on. The next one was a little bit more tongue-in-cheek. It was about the free exercise clause.
Yeah, we got you in actually working out there, or trying to work out.
Yeah, we filmed it
in a gym.
In the gym, to talk about the free exercise clause.
Well done, by the way. Yeah.
Then the next one, so we're trying to kind of go back and forth between serious and lighthearted. So the next one was released on Constitution Day, and that one is really just a rant of mine about how people are just ignorant of the Constitution, don't know what is in the Constitution, or worse, they quote unquote know things that aren't in the Constitution. And so that one really got a pretty good response, and we were trying to decide what we're going to do for the next one, and we said we should do a Christmas special. And as soon as the words Christmas special came out, I knew what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so I knew we were going to talk about some of our cases, but I also wanted to make it, just humorous and entertaining. And so it is sort of shot like a behind-the-scenes look at the filming of the Christmas special, because of the opening scene, you see the green screens in the studio and everything that we're doing. And I had to cajole some of my coworkers to do guest starring roles in the video, and thankfully they did. And so it turned out really well. We're very happy with it. It's gotten a good response on social media, and
I encourage people to watch it because it's only about 3 minutes long. But let's talk about 2 of the cases, because one of those is nobody would be upset about Christmas lights, right? Wrong.
You would think, right? So our clients, the Morrises up in Idaho, had a their Christmas tradition, like many. They put on a pretty elaborate Christmas display on their house, a lot of lights, nativity scenes and so forth. And so it attracted a lot of attention. People would come to see it. And so, part of their faith is helping those less fortunate also. So they decided to start asking when people would come to see the display if they would make a donation to children's charity that they were helping out, multiple children's charities. But when they moved into this new neighborhood, the HOA said you can't do that. They listed off several reasons why. One, that there were non-religious people in the neighborhood, and they were worried about what they might think of religious display. My favorite is they were concerned that it might attract undesirables to the neighborhood. That is the actual word they used, undesirables. people who, undesirables, people who like Christmas lights and want to help kids with cancer. That's undesirable for your neighborhood. So the Morrises actually sued the HOA and won. The jury decided in their favor and said that they had been discriminated against on the basis of religion. But the judge in the case threw out the jury's verdict and entered a verdict in favor of the homeowners association. So our involvement now is appealing that judge's verdict to the Ninth Circuit. So we're going to try to get the jury verdict basically reinstated. And obviously, we're a week before Christmas. It's not going to happen for this Christmas, but with any luck, the Morrises can do this next year for Christmas.
And others that we've talked about where the U.S. Postal Service said, well, you can make up your own stamp unless it's religious. Or, of course, you've had other government agencies say you can't have a nativity scene. And if nothing else, this is a humorous way, Penna, for people to learn a little bit about some of these, if you will, Christmas wars and how First Liberty's been involved.
The Christmas wars have been going on for a couple of decades now. And, some of the things actually, they've either gone away because everybody's just assumed that we're never going to win them, or they've actually gotten better. Like I'm shopping in the mall this week, and I've heard a lot of Merry Christmases where I never heard that. Mm-hmm. And so, some things are just being shown for the absurdity that they truly are. They're being shown to be that. And also it was just taking away people's joy. And Christmas is about, that too, besides being primarily about the birth of Christ. So I think it was great. And I do want you to talk about that final politically correct Christmas carol that you revised, because
so one of the bits in the video is me trying to sing Christmas songs, and the guy who's helping me out in the studio keeps interrupting me, telling me why we can't do these for these various politically correct reasons. So at the end I come back to try and do one a politically correct version, and it's Frosty the Snow Sculpture who identifies as a man. And so
and then you're out of there.
Yeah, and then I'm done. But not to leave our Jewish friends out either, because we talk about this in the video as well.
Yes, that's true.
Lots of people are going to be trying to gather together to celebrate Hanukkah, and they will, all over the country, except in Airmont, New York, where our Orthodox Jewish clients, the village of Airmont, has an ordinance that requires you to get government permission to host a religious gathering in your own home. And as of today, of course, none of our Orthodox Jewish clients have been granted that permission. So it's sort of good news, bad news. Yes, these sorts of things have been going on for a long time, but I actually do think we are turning a corner. I think there is a reason why you're not hearing as much of this sort of thing anymore. And I think going forward, these types of issues, it will be easier to resolve them or prevent them based on the Supreme Court's opinion in our Bladensburg Peace Cross case, where they said monuments, symbols, or practices that are in keeping with the history and tradition of this country are now enjoy a presumption of constitutionality. So the case that we're working on in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware right now, where the city doesn't want to let the Knights of Columbus put up a nativity scene that they have done for years and years and years. Yeah. Well, that's obviously in keeping with the history and tradition of this country and that specific town.
Right.
So again, it's right before Christmas. We're probably not going to be able to resolve this for this Christmas, but if we have to go to federal court, it'll be resolved by next Christmas.
Do you think that the singing of Christmas carols, the naming of the holiday, the break through schools, I'm thinking of schools right here. Do you think calling it Christmas break, which we always called it, Easter vacation, none of that's been gone? Do you think any of that will ever come back, or the acknowledgement that we are celebrating a holiday that actually honors Christ?
I don't know. And frankly, I'm a little bit, to use a religious term, agnostic on that issue anyway. I really don't care what the school district calls it.
I do.
I know what holiday I'm celebrating. What I do care is if you tell a public school student that they cannot say anything about that because they're at a public school. Because that's wrong and it's unconstitutional. And, but whatever the school district decides they want to call it, whatever. I mean,
well, we'd like to have it back if we could. But anyway, let's take a break. And when we come back, we've been talking about some of these court cases, and I do want to at least talk about the one out of the Fifth Circuit Court. So we'll talk about that. And that's the individual mandate and what that means in terms of the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes called Obamacare. But my assignment to you is to go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the one that says, "'Tis the Season to Fight in Court." You might want to watch it for 3 minutes. You'll get a chance to see Lathan doing some music, getting dressed up, doing makeup, having a Santa hat, and all sorts of other things. But you'll also learn about some of these cases. And then I would encourage you to not only watch it, click that share button, put it on your Facebook page or Twitter feed, or if you have a website or something like that, and see if you can start some conversation. But when we come back, we'll talk about a couple of these important court cases, and then we'll get into all sorts of other issues. This has been a busy week. We'll talk about that right after this.
People looking to shop this year for the gender confused have options. Online fashion collections and even retail shops feature what's being called gender-free clothing. Gender-free clothing has been out there for years. I received an ad from a clothing company called Primary that gives kids a chance to choose from a rainbow of colors. The photo shows a kid in a blue dress. It's labeled the boy's long-sleeve dress in cobalt. More recently, some companies have taken trans retail. Fluid Project is a store located in Manhattan's Soho neighborhood. Fortune magazine explains the space is a combination store, cafe, and event space geared toward the LGBTQ community. Inside is an open sales floor with no gender-specific departments. Instead, there are non-gendered mannequins with straight hips in clothing emblazoned with messages like the phrase, "They Power." In addition to the New York location, Fluid partnered with HBO's series Euphoria last summer to open one-day-only pop-up shops in San Francisco, Seattle, and Miami. Euphoria explores the inner worlds of troubled high school students with strong themes surrounding gender identity. In these stores, shoppers were invited to sit in on panel discussions with cast members. Fluid Project founder Rob Smith draws on his 30 years of executive retail experience with brands including Nike, Levi, Macy's, and Victoria's Secret. He says, "We want to erase any preconceived notions of how people should dress." Cosmetics giant Sephora added Trans is Beautiful to its diversity push and offers beauty classes for transgender people. H&M offers a unisex collection that includes mostly denim pieces, jeans, overalls, jackets, and also some hoodies and t-shirts. And Zara has a line dubbed Ungendered. Some of these companies, like H&M, are simply checking the inclusivity box. Others, like Fluid, seek to destigmatize the trans identity. I wish this was a passing fad, but these retail executives are mainstreaming a destructive delusion. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, while we talk about some of these legal issues, let me certainly put one on the table, and that is a 3-judge panel on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has actually argued and made the case that indeed the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, is unconstitutional because the linchpin of that is the idea of the individual mandate. Now, as I shared a little bit yesterday, I remember when the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, this is a couple of years ago, said, we're going to eventually have the Affordable Care Act declared unconstitutional. I said, well, are you really serious about that? And this particular group, back in February of 2018, actually ask a federal judge in Fort Worth to strike down the law as unconstitutional, arguing that the whole law was based on this idea of the individual mandate. And so Judge Reed O'Connor last December actually did so, and it's taken a whole year now. But Penna, this is significant because what it essentially does, I guess, is send it back to reevaluation. But it's the first step towards the declaring, I think, of the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, not just in the Fifth Circuit, but eventually nationwide. What about this?
Right. And, in the other famous where it did go to the Supreme Court, in the NFIB versus Sebelius, Supreme Court, with John Roberts kind of pushing that decision, said that it was constitutional because the penalty that the individual mandate would assess is a tax.
Yes.
So then in 2017, when the tax cut was passed, part of that was to say, well, they reduced the tax to zero, basically. So the individual mandate, yes, it imposed a tax, but the tax was zero. And I think that's when Ken Paxton and company, all the other attorneys general, said, okay, we've got a case now. And they came back and they did win. And so now it's been at the Fifth Circuit. It's been ruled unconstitutional, but it has to go back down now because, we've always said ever since Obamacare was passed that the linchpin was the individual mandate. And I think those who want it struck down would still say it is. And so the whole thing should be struck down. But this panel from the Fifth Circuit said, we'll go back down and make it very clear how the individual mandate is not severable from the rest of it. And so, that's my unlegal way of explaining that. But I think I understand, and hopefully folks do, that now a lower court has to go back and just sort of put that into the case and have it go back up. And it very well could go to the Supreme Court, but it's going to take, while.
Sure. Well, and let's get our expert of legalese to explain severability, because do you strike down part of the law or all of it? Explain that.
Well, you basically just did. Penna's right. What the Fifth Circuit with that 3-judge panel did was send it back to Judge O'Connor and say his decision was appealed to them, and so they ruled that he did not err in saying that Obamacare is unconstitutional without the tax, because that is the only thing that the Supreme Court has said made it constitutional. And by the way, one of the most rhetorically, logically, and legally contorted opinions of my lifetime. It is a train wreck of an opinion.
Yes.
It is written, and you can read it, and you know what happened. They wrote the decision.
He was writing it one way and changed.
And changed his mind.
He did
and
a U-turn.
Had to figure out how to do it. It essentially says, because there's an old case that basically says you can't determine the constitutionality of a tax unless it's been collected, and at this point it had not been. So that opinion starts out by saying this isn't a tax, so we can rule on the constitutionality of it since it's not a tax and we don't have to worry about it being collected yet. It clearly violates the Commerce Clause. It's not constitutional under the Commerce Clause, but it's constitutional because it's a tax. That's basically what that opinion says. It's a disaster. And ever since then, all three branches of the government have been trying to figure out what to do next. And we would not be in this spot right now with Judge O'Connor and the Fifth Circuit, even though I think the Fifth Circuit got it right, and Judge O'Connor will now decide if he thinks all of the Affordable Care Act is unseverable, or if portions of it are and portions of it aren't. We would not be in this spot if the Republicans, when they held all three branches of government, had done what they said they were going to do.
Yes.
They cast show vote after show vote after show vote in the House, repealing Obamacare when they knew it would die in the Senate and when they knew it would get vetoed by the president. When they had control of all three levers of government, all they had to do is pass a very simple bill. You write the bill number of the Affordable Care Act is hereby repealed, and you would have repealed all of it. And you had the power to do that, and they didn't, because they didn't have the guts, and they were too scared, frankly, because they were convinced that they had to replace it with something. When the reaction to that bill was, we want it gone. We would rather go back to the old way than have this. And they did not have the courage to just repeal it root and branch when they had the authority and the ability to do so. And because they didn't, now we're back in the courts trying to do it via the courts. And that's not to say that this isn't a good lawsuit and it's not going to accomplish it, but I predict it will end up back at the Supreme Court or back at the Fifth Circuit and then on to the Supreme Court, because the people we elected to get rid of this did not do it.
And, as to the fear that you didn't replace it with anything, I mean, to me, that's the whole idea. The government should not be designing an overall system for health care for the country.
Yeah.
Different states should have their own regulations that apply to the states, their particular states, and the free market should be able to create a wonderful healthcare system, which would happen. Yes, there has to be some regulation, but when you deal with it at a level that's closer to the people, you get better regulation, and you get what pertains to the type of businesses and industries and people that you have in your state. And this would take time again, but the free market works much more quickly than the bureaucracy, the slow bureaucracy. And so I think, to make healthcare more competitive, more of a free market enterprise would improve it. And if we go the other way and we make it a top-down Medicare for all or whatever, one of the worst things we do is stifle innovation, stifle the quality product that we've had and that we've been famous for and that the whole world depends on. And, we got that through a free market system with some regulation. And, one thing that's been proposed is that you would have some kind of a provision for the states to decide how they're going to deal with people with pre-existing conditions. And so, every state could decide how to deal with that. And that is something that people like across the board. They do like it. So, yes, but you don't have to change the whole system to deal with that.
Ask a veteran if you want to know about government-run health care. And people say, they're against Obamacare because they don't want government-run health care. We have government-run health care.
And we know what that looks like. And they call it Medicare for all, not VA for all, because it's going to look
exactly right.
more like VA for all. And tell me how many people are thinking that's such a great way to get medical care. Yeah. Well, we need to take a break. When we come back, I've been postponing the inevitable, and that is our friends at Christianity Today, and I put friends in air quotes, have a piece called Trump Should Be Removed from Office. And the argument is the facts are unambiguous. The president of the United States has attempted to use his political power to coerce a foreign leader. And so the editor of Christianity Today says it is time for the president to go. And as you might imagine, there have been a few people reacting to it. I've got the piece that Kelly Shackelford actually posted on the website there. Got a piece from Cheryl Chumley that appeared in the Washington Times, and probably one of the best pieces by Michael Brown's been on the program with us before as well. Talks about some of those issues. So we'll talk about Christianity Today of wanting to remove the president of the United States because of his immoral behavior. We'll be talking about that right after this.
Political fundraising literally reaches into the billions of dollars, many times promoting ideas of governance that aren't worth 2 cents. In that light, I want to ask you, how much are the ideas we distribute through Point of View Radio worth to you? How much are those ideas worth to the country? $100,000. Is that a lot of money in your world? If you're like me, that's a pretty big number. But it's an amount a generous friend of Point of View Radio has committed to give if we can get you to help match it. We need your help as we plan for the important year of 2020. Your gift here at year end will be huge in determining what we can do next year. And again, because of this matching gift, your donation is worth twice as much. But this offer is only for a limited time. Don't wait. Get all the details now at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Your doubled gift will spread good ideas to build strong values and a strong nation. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts, and we're going to talk about Christianity today and then get into some other issues. And if you're not familiar, and I would imagine you are, because this has gotten quite a bit of press, not only in the Christian world, but in the secular world. Matter of fact, some people saying this is good evidence that the evangelicals are abandoning ship and leaving Donald Trump. But nevertheless, the editor of the Christianity Today, this would be the editor-in-chief, wrote that the facts in this instance of the impeachment hearings are unambiguous. The President of the United States attempted to use his political power to coerce a foreign leader to harass and discredit one of the president's political opponents. This is not only a violation of the Constitution, more importantly, it is profoundly immoral. And so the argument being made is that this is the need for the president to be removed from office. And then, in addition to calling for the removal of the president from office, the editor-in-chief also says, to many evangelicals who support Mr. Trump in spite of his blackened moral record, we say this: remember who you and whom you serve, who you are and who you serve. Consider how your justification of Mr. Trump's influences your witness to the Lord and Savior. Consider what an unbelieving world will say if you continue to brush off Mr. Trump's immoral words and behavior in the cause of political expediency. If we don't reverse course now, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness for decades to come? So, pretty strong statements coming from Christianity Today, which was a magazine founded by Billy Graham. And in just a minute, when I read some of Kelly Shackelford's comments, you'll see how Kelly pulled those two together. But Penna, what's your thoughts?
Yes, he did a good job. My husband and I subscribe to Christianity Today. We get the print version delivered to our home. And for the last few years, we've made the decision to continue to read it and subscribe. But we've been very concerned about the move to the left, which you also see in some parts of evangelicalism. And I think this is a sign of that. But I will say Mark Galley, who wrote this piece, does not speak for the evangelicals I know. In fact, most of them are concerned, as I am, for this move to the left. I thought the article on the parts of this article that talked about the actual reasons for impeachment sounded to me like some of the Democrat talking points. They were very general, and they were it was unfair. It assumed his guilt. It assumed that many of the things that we who are supporting the president, those people who are supporting the president, don't assume to be true. So Peter Wehner, who I interviewed about a month ago, Michael Gerson, who I read in the Washington Post today, all of these people say they think that everything the left is saying about the president is true, and that Christians are immoral, ungodly, for supporting a president that is this type of a person. So it's an unfair argument in the first place. There are a lot of other reasons to be mad at this column, but I think that's the first reason.
Yes. Kelly Shackelford isn't with us, but if you go to Christianity Today, he actually posted this, and then I'll get Lathan's comments. Kelly Shackelford, and this is, you can find it on the website. As an attorney, I've been trained to follow the law and justice, not ignore the law because the accused is immoral or someone not liked. And I think there's a distinction you want to make between some of the tweets the president has and some of the comments that he's made and some of the rest. But he says Christianity Today failed horribly in this editorial. Nowhere do they even attempt to justify that this is bribery, treason, hard crimes, or misdemeanors.
It's not. No crime is even alleged. And then he says, if Billy Graham were president, would CT advocate impeachment for the same act? Of course not. But they justify impeachment against Trump because he is immoral and it is popular to attack him. And so Kelly says, sad and very dangerous. May their own approach never be applied to them. So you have to make a distinction between some of the immoral behavior, not some, quite a bit, by the president, and also whether or not this is a justification for impeachment and removal from office. And so at least Kelly responds to part of the legal issue, but Lathan, I want to get your comments as well.
Well, I mean, Kelly's exactly right. The Constitution spells out what you can remove a president for. Treason, bribery, or a high crime or misdemeanor.
One of those four or all of those four. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I mean, the moral character of the man in office is not an impeachable, it is not a justification for removing that person from office.
You could vote against him.
Absolutely.
You could criticize him, but the two are disconnected, and they should be disconnected, but they seem to be connected even in this editorial. I understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's I'll be the first one to say that, I mean, Trump does something on a daily basis that makes me cringe. He has not done anything that warrants removal from office. That doesn't mean that I, like every tweet that he sends out or the comment about the late congressman. I thought was despicable and just he owes that family an apology. Other behaviors in his past. I mean, there are lots of reasons for people in evangelical circles, on the right, the left, wherever. He gives you plenty of reasons not to vote for him.
Yeah.
Okay. Every politician does. He has given people reasons to vote for him. The things that you don't like about this president are probably the same things that I don't like about this president, but they do not rise to the level of he must then be removed from office and undo an election. The man won. He is the president. Whether you like his personal character or not is irrelevant to the question of removing him from office via the impeachment process.
Mark Galley writes that he should be removed, we believe, is not a matter of partisan loyalties, but loyalty to the creator of the Ten Commandments. So if you're loyal to the creator, you would be for removing him from office, according to Mark Galley. He's being a bit of a scold, in a sense, to evangelicals who support the president in a strong way. And, that's certainly his prerogative and their prerogative to do. But also, I think believers who support the president, who appreciate him, have big reasons for doing so. One, he's the most pro-life president we've ever had. He's been blatantly pro-life and expanded the sanctity of human life in our country. He protects evangelicals. He protects religious liberty. He's beating back political correctness in ways that have frustrated the right and conservatives and Christians for decades, and it's just gotten worse. And so he's opening up, I think, the public square it's gradual, but it's happening, to be able to speak the truth. Whereas the left wants to prevent us from doing so. I mean, these are things that are important to Christians. And I think, he was elected despite the quote unquote immoral character that he has. He was elected. People made a calculation. And I think if you look between anyone on the left who could be running against him and him, you're going to have somebody who's advocating unbiblical policies across the board to choose between them and him, who, yes, perhaps there's some things that are distasteful, but most of the things that he's running on are things that the evangelical Christian citizen in America would support and actually applaud.
I would think so. Mark Galley, to be fair to him, would argue that, we called for the removal of Bill Clinton, which I didn't agree with then. I just didn't think that rose to the level of treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. So we have to call for the removal of Donald Trump. But I do see a difference. Let's take a break. We'll take some more of your calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many of the Democratic presidential candidates have been critical of charter schools, and you may wonder why. After all, they are public schools and have a relatively good track record. David Osborne, writing in the Wall Street Journal, documents some of these changes made against charter schools. Senator Elizabeth Warren argues that these schools strain the resources of school districts. Senator Bernie Sanders also says the growth of the charter schools has drained funding from the public school system. This is interesting since the only difference between charter schools and other public schools is the fact that they can operate independently of district bureaucracies. Of course, that's the real reason. Osborne reminds us that no interest group has more clout in Democratic primaries than teacher unions. In the last presidential election, the American Federation of Teachers and National Education Association combined spent $64 million. Charter schools are free to unionize, but rarely do. Only about 11% of them chose to do so. As the charter school movement grows, union influence shrinks. Charter schools are quite successful and provide an alternative to millions of students, two-thirds of which are non-white. Graduation rates, college-going rates, and college completion rates are also higher among students who enroll in charter schools. There is another benefit: competition. We don't have true school choice and won't get it anytime soon, but the presence of charter schools does provide some competition to the public schools. It encourages school leaders and teachers to improve their schools so that they are more attractive to parents wanting to give their children the best education they can receive. Charter schools don't deserve the criticism they are receiving these days from many of these candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. There is a very good piece by Dr. Michael Brown, and I will read that in just a minute. But I want to hear some of your comments. Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts have weighed in. I know they have more to say, but let's go, first of all, to Texas, KCTA and Thomas. I know you've been waiting a while to express your opinion about the CT article. What would you like to say?
Well, I watch Riley and Hannity and Liz Wheeler and Ledger and Laura, whatever her name is, the conservative talk show host, and the Mormon guy. Can't remember his name. But anyway, I notice all these people are Roman Catholic, except for the Mormon, and there's one Seventh-day Adventist. What I want to say, though, is conservatism does not equal Christianity. There's a lot of, you read your Bible, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, that Satan's emissaries appear as angels of light and men of God. And Pence claims to be a born-again evangelical Catholic, which is impossible. The Catholic Church is satanic, and it.
Well, I was hoping I was going to get an intelligent conversation, not one that's going to be Catholic bashing, but nevertheless, I think I get the idea, and that is we may theologically have some disagreements, but I think we can also recognize that even though I might disagree with somebody on a different theological issue, I can certainly recognize the value of life and the value of First Amendment issues and a variety of other topics that we've been talking about here. And we don't necessarily expect the president or any president to agree with us theologically, or even some of the talk show hosts, but we can certainly recognize
act like a Christian should act necessarily.
But,
I mean, that was not part of his campaign promises.
Nobody thought that was the case. What is so surprising to me is, given his background and given even his previous experience, I would not have predicted any of, or at least a lot of the policies that have been implemented. You said he was pro-life. I think that's a fair statement. Many people say he may be the most pro-life president. He's been the most pro-Israel president, and that one really caught me off guard. And to be honest, I want to ask Lathan about this in just a minute, but I'll go to Penna first. I thought that if he actually put people on the court, they'd be kind of like his sister. And instead, they're the kind of like the people that work with you at First Liberty. But
well, that's right.
This.
And, I interviewed Carrie Severino in her book about the Kavanaugh hearings. And, we also talked about just this president and the list that he put forward during the campaign of all the justices. And he's always gone to the legal community that's very conservative and the Christian community to get the names of justices. And that's who he's put on the courts. I mean, the courts have been populated by these wonderful people that are going to protect religious liberty for decades to come. So there was one thing Thomas said that I did agree with, and that is conservatism does not equal Christianity. Christianity does not equal conservatism. A lot of conservative policies do line up with biblical positions on things, but I will say that's probably true. And I don't think, I think some of these people that are critiquing the president are they expect too much from our leaders. They expect them to be theologians, and they expect them to be the moral leader that, it's sort of an impossible standard almost. And I've always even seen some conservatives that have done that. For a long time, I've been concerned about that because that's not really, you can't always roll that into one person. And I don't know where President Trump stands with the Lord. I have no idea. All I know is I've been pleased as a Christian, as a believer, with what he's done with religious liberty, with life, with making the economy better for the struggling person. I mean, he's done all of those things. And so, we're applauding that. And the alternative, just think about the alternative when you heard the debate last night of what these other candidates are proposing. What if we put him out of office by impeachment or in an election? What are we going to get?
One of the arguments that Marco Rubio has here, and I posted it for people to read, is he sent out some tweets, and he was kind of just having some fun at the expense of the House. Today in the Senate, we're working on things that matter. We continued filling vacancies in the judiciary with good judges. Tomorrow, we'll confirm more judges. The Deputy Secretary of State will fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year, which is actually, I think, what the Senate and the House is supposed to do. And I think the president has set a record for the most number of judges on the circuit court. Is that true?
That's right. He's now hit 50 Circuit Court of Appeals nominees who have been confirmed. In 3 years.
Which it took 8 years for President Obama, right?
To get that number.
Okay.
Right.
And these are good people, too. They're not just names. These are people that you've worked with, people that have done pro bono work for you and things like that,
we
right?
do research on every nominee when they're announced. And we look for one thing and one thing only, because it's the only kind of law that we practice, as we look for indication of where they stand on religious liberty and the protection of religious liberty. And if they have a good record on it, we say so. If they have a bad record on it, we say so. If there's not a record, then maybe they're an attorney or maybe they're a district court judge, but they've never had that issue in front of them for some reason. If there's no record, then we will say so. There's not enough information for us to say if this person is going to be good on religious liberty or not, and we won't take a position as to they're good or they're bad on religious liberty. And the overwhelming majority of Trump's nominees have been outstanding on the issue of religious liberty. As you mentioned, some attorneys who have volunteered to work on cases with First Liberty are now on the bench.
Yes.
Jim Ho among them.
Is a good example.
And then our own Matthew Kaczmarek, Deputy General Counsel, is now federal district
court up there in Amarillo.
Amarillo.
Yeah.
And that had never happened before. No one had ever been currently working in a religious liberty law firm and go from that firm to the federal bench. That had never happened before.
When you speak about religious liberty, also I could add the freedom of conscience. And, a lot of Obamacare was left to interpretation and rules writing by HHS. And so there was a lot of damage done with regard to people's freedom of conscience. For instance, the contraceptive mandate, and you had to have the whole Hobby Lobby case, but that did not fix it for everyone. And so this president has gone back and he's issued executive orders that have opened up freedom of conscience in the areas of medical practice and a lot of other things. And, what about all these adoption agencies who have had to close down because of interpretations of what the word sex means? And, the things that are happening in schools with bathrooms. So this president is in so many of the things that he's done that he hasn't been able to get through Congress, but he's done as an executive order. He's also protected the concerns of Christians in those ways. So while we're sitting here, I got an email from my husband because I mentioned before we've been subscribers of Christianity Today, and he's been reading about this whole article, and he read the article, and he said, I just canceled our subscription. So I guess we won't be reading it anymore.
Well, again, announcement on the air. Let's take some more phone calls. We'll go to Missouri. KTTK. James, thank you for joining us today. What's your point of view?
Well, my point of view is that these people that are accusing the president are, if they are Christian people, as some of them claim to be, I wonder why they forgot the passage in the Bible where Jesus says, he that is without sin should cast the first stone.
Well, again, I recognize that we are to make judgments, wise judgments. The scriptures do talk about having discernment. So this isn't saying that we're perfect and they're wrong, but it's just an illustration, again, of how divisive this has become. But I'd like to at least get one more phone call in before the bottom of the hour. So we'll head right out to California. And Adam, I think you want to add something to our conversation. So you have the floor.
Yeah, I agree with the young man before, but religion aside, every time you hear anything positive about Trump, it's only on Christian radio. If you look at social media or just any news or government, their whole agenda for the last 4 years was the negative side of Trump. Even when he took out the leader of ISIS, that was on the news maybe a week tops.
Well, and
it's amazing what's been accomplished despite that.
I've been making this list because I'm writing an article for the next Outlook, and I just looking at the economic things that are listed by various groups, including the White House. And then you look at all the things in terms of foreign policy and the degrading of ISIS, a good example of that. And it's just, after a while, I go through this. I do this every day, pretty much. And there are times when I'll go and, I'd forgotten about that. And, what about that? And we haven't even talked about USMCA and all trade deals. And yesterday we're talking about the fact that we thought that this tariff war, this trade war was going to explode, and yet we had 266,000 new jobs just announced for last month. And now we have what looks like at least a truce in the trade wars, which tells you economically it's going to look even better next year. You start adding up all of this stuff, and you just say, if you may dislike, and I see some people want to talk about Trump's morality, okay, that's fair, that's honest too, but don't ignore all the positive things that have happened that affect your faith, your family, and your freedom. So we'll come back and take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts with us. And again, I postponed some of the conversation about Christianity Today because we knew this would generate lots of phone calls. And if you just happen to be joining us, again, the editor of Christianity Today actually believes that the facts are unambiguous and this president should be removed from office. But more importantly, also says that evangelicals should not support him because of his immoral behavior. This piece that just came out by Michael Brown, I guess I'll post it Monday since we already have a lot of articles, but 4 points he makes, which I thought were very well said. First of all, the editor, Mike Galley, has the right to speak out and certainly expresses the sentiments of a number of people that are inside the Church of Jesus Christ, so I understand that. Second, he says that many evangelicals do not believe the Democrat charges against President Trump, and quote some of the material that we've even talked about with John Smirek, who actually writes for the stream. Number three, he says, I share Galley's concern that evangelicals can seem more closely aligned with the president, with the Lord, and says, there is a sense in which when, for example, and I love his illustration, we should call balls and strikes with fairness and impartiality. When we have ethical behavior by anybody, including the president, we should call out that. But then also, he says, I believe those on the side of Mark Galley need to listen to Trump-supporting evangelicals who feel that despite his evident shortcomings, the man has actually done quite a bit of good. And I think you can have both of those things simultaneously. Say, we don't always like the behavior of the president, certainly some of the tweets. Just talked about what he said about John Dingell and everything else, which he needs to apologize for. But that doesn't invalidate at all the positive that has happened. And there are people that you've interviewed here, Penna, on this program that just say, well, his immoral behavior is enough to get him out of office, and we'd rather have a Democrat, not putting in the kind of people that will make Lathan Watts and Kelly Shackelford's job easier. I just have trouble accepting that argument.
And some of them will say, well, no, just support someone else from a third party. But that's just unreal. That's so unrealistic. And in politics, we have to be shrewd. The president may not be a Christian. He may not be godly. We don't know. I mean, we know some things that have happened that we don't like. But as Michael Brown said, he's been a godsend. He's been a godsend. And I don't think even under some of the folks that we supported in the primaries, I don't necessarily think we would have gotten as far as we have on certain things. And it's because of this man's personality.
Let me take some more phone calls. Again, somebody wants to talk about morality. So Shirley in Arizona, what's your point of view?
Yes, I wanted to talk about the morality part. I don't see anything wrong with the stuff that he does. He does everything to help the American people and the Christian people. The problem he has is what he says. And you know what he says? I think his moral problem is he says exactly what he thinks at that time. He has a problem with saying things that he shouldn't say. But as far as his morality, I don't see that he's done anything morally wrong as president for this country. Amen. I mean, he did things morally wrong a long time ago when he was younger, but he's repented of that, and he's not doing that now. And all of us have done things when we were younger that we're ashamed of.
Yep.
And I think that if all these other politicians, if every one of them would do exactly what he does, say exactly what they think, I think we'd be horrified at what they'd say.
Yeah. Well, and we haven't even talked about the presidential debate last night and some of the other open mic comments that some of these candidates have said. And you've worked in a few various campaigns over the years, governor races and senator races. You can speak to this, Lathan, that some of these individuals that present themselves in front of the camera are sort of unsavory people behind the scenes, aren't they?
A lot of times, yes. I was fortunate in my career to work with a lot of really good men.
Yes. But you could talk about some of their opponents and some of the others.
Well, absolutely. And, even in races when I wasn't working directly in the race, when I was working for, like a trade association or a PAC or something where I was involved in a lot of different races around the country all at once, I've seen it firsthand. And it's something that every Christian has to figure out for themselves.
Right.
Okay, so we were talking in the break, and I said, there were people that looked at Donald Trump and looked at his behavior in the past and looked at what they knew of his personality and his character and said, I cannot vote for that type of man. And you'll get no argument from me. To me, that is a perfectly legitimate conclusion to arrive at as a person of faith. There were other people who looked at that and sort of made the calculation that Penna mentioned a few moments ago that, no, I don't like that behavior in his past. I don't see any evidence of some of that behavior continuing now, other than the flamethrower Twitter feed and the mouth that just never stops. but who looked at the alternative and who looked at the policies that he was advocating for and said, this is the choice that I have. It's this or that, and so I'm going to vote for him. That is also a perfectly legitimate, in my opinion, conclusion to arrive at. Christianity does not, the providential will of God cannot be thwarted by a president of the United States. It cannot be done.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing can stop it. He can use a moral leader. He can use an immoral leader. And that's why he's God and I'm Lathan. I don't try to determine in real time what the providential will of God is. I've seen it revealed to me in my life, and it has almost exclusively been in hindsight.
Yes.
When I look back upon something and see that. Okay. There are lots of things that people of faith can disagree on, and both of their conclusions are perfectly legitimate conclusions for a person of faith to arrive at. And neither one of you salvation is in jeopardy because of it. There is room for disagreement. Faith is supposed to be pervasive in all aspects of our life, and we live in a republic. And so one aspect of a Christian's life in America is politics. It consumes media, okay? And you would think that it is the be-all and end-all. It is not. It is one part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe we will be held accountable for every decision that we make, okay? That said, sometimes we need to take a step back and go, you know what? The world is not going to end.
That's right.
Based on who we elect as president. Christianity has spread across the world in every form of government there is. In a free country like ours, in a totalitarian nightmare that is China, it is one of the fastest growing areas of Christianity in the world. They are on track to have the largest Christian population in the world.
Right.
So I think all of us can sometimes just take a breath and give our fellow believers, even the author of this article that we're discussing, a little benefit of the doubt and say, we can agree to disagree on this. This is one aspect of my life. It does not consume, it is not the be-all, end-all of what it means to be a Christian in America.
You know, Daniel 4:17, just simply says that this is the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High, that would be God, Yahweh, is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets them over the lowliest of men. And I think our next caller wants to address that. So let's go to South Carolina. Ruth, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want my name put out there, but anyway.
Oh, my bad. Okay.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Well, what I was reading in Isaiah 45, and it says Cyrus. I look at President Trump as Cyrus, King Cyrus. And when I was reading this, my mind immediately went to him. And it says, this is what the Lord says to Cyrus, his anointed one, whose right hand he will empower. Anyway, what King Cyrus did, he leveled the mountains. He went before him, the Lord said, and he would smash down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. And I feel like, he anointed him to just cut down everything that Obama, that he was trying to, liberty, the abortion thing. And so, and then it says, I will raise up Cyrus to fulfill my righteous purpose, and I will guide all his actions. He will restore my city and free my captive people, and not for reward. I, the Lord Almighty, have spoken.
Again, we're coming to a break, so I unfortunately had to cut you off a little bit, but I think we go with that. And I thought, I mentioned Daniel 4:17. Another one would be Proverbs 21:1, which simply says, a king's heart is like a stream of water directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he wishes. That's a providential promise there, isn't it? And so we have a full bank of phone calls, but we also have one of those mandatory breaks. And so thank you for that about Cyrus. We'll come back and take a few more phone calls. And if you find yourself saying, well, wait a minute, I want to make some comments. Well, it is Friday, but on Monday, I'll give you that opportunity again. Is that fair? Because I suspect there'll still be a few people talking about the Christianity Today editorial. And if you want to express your comment and don't get on today, you'll have a chance on Monday. We'll take a break. We'll be right back.
People looking to shop this year for the gender confused have options. Online fashion collections and even retail shops feature what's being called gender-free clothing. Gender-free clothing has been out there for years. I received an ad from a clothing company called Primary that gives kids a chance to choose from a rainbow of colors. The photo shows a kid in a blue dress. It's labeled the boy's long-sleeve dress in cobalt. More recently, some companies have taken trans retail. Fluid Project is a store located in Manhattan's Soho neighborhood. Fortune magazine explains the space is a combination store, cafe, and event space geared toward the LGBTQ community. Inside is an open sales floor with no gender-specific departments. Instead, there are non-gendered mannequins with straight hips in clothing emblazoned with messages like the phrase, "they power." In addition to the New York location, Fluid partnered with HBO's series Euphoria last summer to open one-day-only pop-up shops in San Francisco, Seattle, and Miami. Euphoria explores the inner worlds of troubled high school students with strong themes surrounding gender identity. In these stores, shoppers were invited to sit in on panel discussions with cast members. Fluid Project founder Rob Smith draws on his 30 years of executive retail experience with brands including Nike, Levi, Macy's, and Victoria's Secret. He says, "We want to erase any preconceived notions of how people should dress." Cosmetics giant Sephora added Trans is Beautiful to its diversity push and offers beauty classes for transgender people. H&M offers a unisex collection that includes mostly denim pieces, jeans, overalls, jackets, and also some hoodies and t-shirts. And Zara has a line dubbed ungendered. Some of these companies, like H&M, are simply checking the inclusivity box. Others, like Fluid, seek to destigmatize the trans identity. I wish this was a passing fad, but these retail executives are mainstreaming a destructive delusion. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts. Let me just mention we have Penna Dexter's commentary today, and we haven't gotten to that. Maybe I will even take some time next week to focus on it again because I thought it was really good. And one of the other things we were going to talk about, but of course all these conversations about Christianity Today have kind of pushed it off the page. We like to always from time to time mention good films or television. Just the other day we had The Actor in Vindication, which is Amazon Prime, which has got a real kind of faith-based emphasis on that. And one of these films, which, okay, is going to be violent because it's called 1917, and it is an incredible story about World War I. Now, again, obviously a parental advisory. You don't want to take young kids because this is just like going to Saving even Private Ryan. But if you want a film which our producer, Steve Miller, has seen, which he says is a fantastic film, moving, immersive. Sam Mendes narrows the focus down to a single event, really just one man who's trying to save his brother. It really helps you understand what the Great War, or the war to end all war, was all about. And it's got all sorts of name actors in it who actually have just kind of bit parts, which is kind of interesting. So we want to just say that if you would like to see a film with tremendous sacrifice, fighting for the greater good, but of course is violent, so it's one where we can't, without lots of disclaimers, because it's war, recommend. I just thought we would mention that, and I think you're going to find
What's the name of the film?
1917, which
it's in theaters.
It's coming out in the theaters here, and of course Benedict Cumberbatch and all sorts of people that you would know are in it, but they actually have really small roles. Really just follows a lot of no names through the story. And it really just helps you understand what it was like to be in the trenches, what it was like to fight World War I, just, all the things that are part of that. And so anyway, we just thought we would just mention that, and maybe next week I'll get into it a little bit more. But we have so many people who want to speak out about what we have been talking about. So let's head first to South Carolina and talk to Patricia. I think you have some comments for our audience. So what would you like to share?
Yes, sir. I thank you. In Isaiah 55, verse 8, it tells us that God's thoughts and ways are not ours. I'm paraphrasing. But in the midst of it, I was in a situation working for a state university, and a friend of mine and I in the university were praying for a change in somebody in administration who was targeting believers and taking out people that were really working for the benefit of the university. In the midst of it, as we prayed, God brought in another person, released that person out. That person that came in was more corrupt, did more damage in some ways, but on the other hand, God used them to take out the corrupt that was there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes that happens. God uses sometimes ungodly people. You certainly see that through the Old Testament in many cases, and I think you also see it in the New Testament. So a good example of that. And just a minute ago, we were talking about the film 1917. It comes out actually Christmas Day, but that's next Wednesday. Isn't hard to believe. Here we are. Yeah, Christmas is next week. But at least on Monday, I'll try to mention it again, and that gets you a little closer to watching it. And again, I just think it was one that I wanted you to know about. I'm going to cycle through a few more phone calls if we can, but I want to get some comments at the end here. North Carolina. Michael, you have the floor. What would you like to add?
Hello. Yeah, I was just, I don't like particularly principalizing scripture, but it would seem to me that God kind of put Mike Pence as vice president as opposed to president to remind us that, we're to be in the world and not of the world, kind of like Pharaoh and Daniel. And also another comment is, where was the cause for impeachment from past administrations that did things that weren't really what we would call moral, as Christians. That was it, basically. Maybe y'all can remember that.
Sure. Well, and let me just talk about that, because the other day I talked about this idea of past presidential behavior. You might remember that conversation, because one of the things we were hearing was, this is something that we have never seen before. Let me just quote for a second Michael Gerhardt, who is the individual who is a law professor from North Carolina. Remember that? And he said, Trump's conduct was worse than the misconduct of any prior president. And Lathan is shaking his head because I use a few examples. Even in the first hour today, I talked about John Adams and Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, and Andrew Jackson ignoring court and law precedents, actually using his power to ethnically cleanse lands. Just think of the Trail of Tears. Franklin Delano Roosevelt directed IRS audits on his political enemies. You had Lyndon Johnson use the CIA to actually spy on Barry Goldwater and his political opponents. You have President Kennedy asking his brother, who then was the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, to deport one of his mistresses. And, of course, we have to mention Roosevelt actually wrote an executive order to, in prison, basically intern 120,000 Japanese Americans. None of that is rising to the level of Trump's behavior, according to the testimony we heard a couple of weeks ago in the House Intelligence Committee and then in the House Judiciary.
I've often said that there are some people in politics whose greatest weapons are their ignorance and their audacity. And to make a statement like that requires both.
Yes.
You must either be incredibly ignorant of history to not know any of the things that you just talked about, and you could go on. There are plenty
stopped
others.
Early because I want to give you a chance.
Or you have the audacity to state something that a U.S. president asking the head of another nation to investigate corruption that involves that president's nation and our own is somehow worse than the suspension of habeas corpus, than the rounding up of American citizens and imprisoning them, of weaponizing the IRS, of asking your brother, the Attorney General, to deport your mistress, of having wiretapping Martin Luther King.
Oh, boy, yeah. I
mean,
didn't
you
even
can
get
go
into that.
on and on and on. You have the transcript of the call. That is the sort of the underlying action that prompted this whole thing. You have, the president of the other nation who has said he didn't even know the aid had been held up when they were discussing it. This is like, putting somebody on trial for kidnapping, and the guy who he's alleged to have kidnapped is sitting in the back of the room going, "I'm right here. Here I am." Like, he doesn't have me. Here I am. The guy's actually sitting in the courtroom. You have the president of this. I didn't even know the aid was held up.
Yeah.
The guy told me that you ran on getting rid of corruption in your government. Here's a situation that appears to be corrupt. Can you look into this? I think you should look into this.
Yeah.
I think you've probably said this on the show, but we didn't say it today. The left was looking at impeaching the president the day he took office.
Yes.
They've always looked for a reason and a way to impeach him. What they came up with wasn't that great, but they ran out of time, and that's why it's happening.
Yeah, and the Mueller report came down, and then he testified, this is interesting, July 24th, and that turned out to be really nothing. And the phone call was July 25th, and immediately somebody said, "Oh, that must be it." We got it. And so it just translated from Russia to Ukraine. I mean, the coincidence is not a coincidence, and so that's something to think about. Lathan, just before we go, I think especially as we get into the Christmas season, I hope everybody will watch your little videos there, and we have a link there, Legal Ease. So again, as they go to First Liberty, they can support you, and when they support you, they're supporting all the things you've been talking about here today, and also those videos that you're going out there. And I got a feeling these are going to go viral because we've been giving it some national attention today.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't exactly break my heart if they went viral. I think they're a lot of fun to make. I hope people enjoy them, share them for whatever they're worth. I hope you like them.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, Penna. I know we're going to together next Friday, so you will be here, right?
Yes, we'll be here next Friday. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas to you. And I know Kelly Shackelford joined us for a year in review, and I think you're doing that as well. So there'll be some other opportunities. Enjoy the weekend, and back on Monday. If you didn't get through, we'll take your phone calls. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you next week.
Political fundraising literally reaches into the billions of dollars, many times promoting ideas of governance that aren't worth 2 cents. In that light, I want to ask you, how much are the ideas we distribute through Point of View Radio worth to you? How much are those ideas worth to the country? $100,000. Is that a lot of money in your world? If you're like me, that's a pretty big number. But it's an amount a generous friend of Point of View Radio has committed to give if we can get you to help match it. We need your help as we plan for the important year of 2020. Your gift here at year end will be huge in determining what we can do next year. And again, because of this matching gift, your donation is worth twice as much. But this offer is only for a limited time. Don't wait. Get all the details now at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Your doubled gift will spread good ideas to build strong values and a strong nation. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.